Hi friends, welcome to your third highlight reel called The End and the Beginning. Now it's called that because we are talking about the end of the Old Covenant and the beginning of the New Covenant, the transition between the covenants. And the concept of covenant becomes very important. We'll talk more about that. But it's also called The End and the Beginning because you've just read the last chapter of the first section of the book and the first chapter of the second section of the book. Hope that's making sense. You'll notice the end of religion is divided into three sections. We've just finished the beginning of the end, section 1. Section 2, we've just started a scandalous life. And this second section now, in the weeks ahead, move into a more deeper dive into the historical, day in and day out, example and teachings of Jesus. And I think it's important that we put Jesus in his place, so to speak. We look at Jesus in his first century Jewish context, and we thoroughly understand what is happening there and then, so that in the third section of the book, and the irreligious implications, we can say, what are the implications for here and now? But before we get to the application, how do we apply this here and now? We've got to understand Jesus there and then. And so I hope over this next couple of sessions, you'll have the patience and the excitement to just dig into Jesus within his context. When we talk about Jesus, who are we talking about? This historical figure named Jesus. Well, in Hebrew or Aramaic, we might say Yeshua. And Yeshua in English is actually Joshua, and not Jesus. We pronounce it Jesus actually just to help us identify which Joshua we're talking about, because there's another Joshua in the Bible, more than one, but there's a primary Joshua in the Old Testament who is the successor to Moses. You know the story of Israel being slaves in Egypt, and then through Moses, God delivers them out of Egypt, you know, the 10 Commandments and the plagues, and all right, he leads them out of Egypt and into the wilderness where they wander for 40 years, but they still don't have a home. It is Moses' successor, Joshua, who then leads them into the promised land, into Canaan, which is filled with Canaanites, the people who already live there. Well, now what's going to happen? Well, Joshua is the military leader who leads Israel into their own home and helps them find a sense of place and peace through violence, through conquering the enemy. Well, that was hundreds of years earlier. Now, at the time of Jesus, Israel now lives in the promised land, but they have been invaded by Rome. There's a new enemy. And they would like, once again, for a new Joshua to come along. And just as he helped them slaughter the Canaanites, they would like him to help them slaughter the Romans, or at least drive them out of their land. And so in the first century, we find out that many parents were naming their sons Joshua, Yeshua. They were hoping maybe our son will be the one to lead this revolt against the Romans. And so it's no accident that Jesus was named Joshua. And I think it's very telling. And it sets us up for seeing something beautiful. Jesus redeems rather than rejects the whole narrative of Joshua, and he changes it so that as the new Joshua, he does lead God's people into battle. But now it's not battle against a certain ethnic group or a certain militaristic enemy. Now it's a battle against the things that divide us, the things that cause us to be separated and to judge one another. So Jesus does lead us in battle, but now the land that we're conquering is the land between you and me that separates us, that allows us to stereotype and to, through prejudiced eyes, to judge one another from a distance. He wants us to conquer that land, to pull us closer together. So Jesus is a great name for this guy, Joshua, Yeshua, the one who conquers, but conquers in the name of love for the purpose of love. And so an angel appears. It wasn't actually just Mary and Joseph's idea to name Jesus Yeshua. An angel from God says, this is intentional. In Matthew chapter 1, an angel appears to Joseph and says, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, or Yeshua, because he will save his people from the Romans, their enemies. He will save his people from their sins. Jesus teaches us how to start at home and say, what are the impulses and the inclinations within all of us that are contributing to the division rather than that are part of that reconciliation? How beautiful. And so this new Joshua, this Yeshua, says, I'm going to lead us into a whole new way of being together with one another. It's called the new covenant. And just a reminder, covenant is a way of being in relationship with God and with one another. And this is what Jesus saw was a primary purpose in his life and his death, bringing in this new way of being in relationship. It was the night just before he was crucified when Jesus has one final meal with his disciples called the Last Supper, a Passover Seder, where Jesus takes one of the cups of the Passover Seder and he says, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. Theologians think about the death of Jesus in a variety of ways. They have theories about what actually happened on the cross. They're called atonement theories. And there's many different ways, like a multifaceted diamond, that we could look at the death of Jesus to try and explain exactly what's going on there. But Jesus certainly saw his own death primarily as the cutting of a new covenant. And we need to start there with what Jesus said about his own death. This cup, he offers them, is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Back in ancient days, rather than signing a covenant or a contract in business terms, they would cut a covenant, which means they would kill an animal instead of signing a signature. Most people would be illiterate, and so they had to find a way of saying, I really mean this. I really take this seriously. So they would sacrifice an animal. So Jesus enters that whole system and says, I'm cutting a new covenant in my blood. I'm not going to sacrifice another animal. I'm going to be the last sacrifice, the final sacrifice that shuts down the old and brings in the new. The layers of irony and profundity go deep, so that the religious leaders representing the religious establishment, representing the old covenant, they're the ones who call for the death of Jesus. But ironically, irony upon irony, they're calling for the death of the one who will cut the new covenant that actually ends the old covenant, which is what they're fighting for. Jesus ushers in then the new covenant through his death. The Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians, he says, he has made us competent ministers of a new covenant. We're all called to be ministers, people who carry this message forward of a new way of being in relationship with God and with one another. Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Don't try and go back into the old way of the rules, regulations, rituals, and routines of the letter of the law. It was for a time, but now God's moved on. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. So this week in your reading in chapter 7 and 8, you've read about the difference between the old and the new covenants. You've read about the planned obsolescence baked into the old covenant. The scandal of particularity, the fact that if God is going to become one of us in a given historical context, he's going to be a this and not a that, because that's what human beings are. We are thises and not that's. That's why Jesus is male and not female, why he is Jewish and not Irish, why he is first century and not 21st century. God is everywhere at all times, but human beings are not. And so as God becomes human in Christ, he enters into a particular form of human expression. And then he, from that point of particularity, opens the message to the world, to all people in all places of all times. We've asked the question in the reading, was Jesus anti-Semitic? And we've said no more than any other Old Testament prophet or Hebrew prophet who is rebuking the people of Israel for their hypocrisy and challenging them. But that doesn't mean he's anti-Semitic. Jesus himself, of course, is Jewish, and his first followers were all Jewish. This is an in-house debate. But it's important that we do nail this down, especially for the readings going forward, because Jesus is very hard on the Jewish religion of his day, not because it's Jewish, but because it's religious, because it has fallen in love with the rules, regulations, rituals, and routines, and is not open to hearing a message about the heart. And we can't soften that message. We want to lean into that so that we can get the transferable rebuke and apply it to our lives today. So we are going to be studying the harsh rebuke of Jesus towards the Jewish religion of the first century, so that we can understand how we can apply that to the Christian religion of the 21st century, and indeed every religion of all time. Some people have said, well, Jesus was so harsh on the Jewish religious leaders of his day, and that has been hijacked by dark phases of the Christian church to lead toward anti-Semitism, absolutely. And so their response to that is to say, no, Jesus was just a gentle reformer. He's just reforming the Jewish religion, but he's certainly not rebuking it as harshly as we. No, that's not the way either. We're going to miss out on the rebuke that we can apply to us. Rather, we stare into it and we understand why Jesus is so hard on the Jewish religious leaders of his day. It's not because they're Jewish. We're looking then at the weeks ahead at how Jesus brings about a transformation in the area of Torah, the law, tradition built on the law, tribalism, the ethnic division that can often happen, how Jesus makes us all one, on territory, that sense of land, of the holy land and holy space that must be fought for, and also on temple, the idea that there's no special holy place we go to get close to God, but that God has come to us and we become the temple organically and relationally. Some great stuff ahead. Last thing before we wrap up. Sometimes I'm asked the question, yeah, but Bruxy, did this Jesus even exist? I mean, did he even exist? I find that really interesting because one of the things we can usually agree on is that whoever came up with these ideas had to exist. Ideas don't float around independently formed and then just seep into human history. Ideas come from minds, and minds belong to people. So whoever came up with these ideas had to exist. We have 4 first-century Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and while they have different perspectives on a singular event, they are obviously recording on one source of thinking, and that source, that person, would have been first century. These are all written within the first century, would be thoroughly Jewish, because they're steeped in a Jewish perspective. So there's a first century Jew who existed and who came up with this stuff. Let's give that person a name. That's who we're talking about. And sometimes some people say, well, how do you know his name was Jesus? I say, okay, well, we can call him Bob. We'll call this the what about Bob theory. Do you believe Bob existed? The source of this content, this way of thinking. He had to exist in the first century. So Bob existed. But then I also want to point out that it's probably unlikely that any first century Jew is called Bob. But you know what was a really common name? It's very historically likely that this person was called Yeshua, Joshua, Jesus. That's just quite likely. So now we've shifted the conversation. Did Jesus exist? He had to exist. The one who came up with this irreligious message had to exist because the message exists in the first century in Israel. Now we shift the conversation to, okay, but did this person who did exist actually rise from the dead? Did he actually turn water into wine? Did he actually walk on water? Did he raise other people from the dead? Now we're having a conversation about a historical person and what we can know about them. And we'll talk later in these sessions about why I believe that the answer is yes to all of the above, that this historical person actually worked all those miracles. But at least we should agree. We are embarking on a journey of understanding better the message and the mission of a real person. All right, I wish you all the best. Grace and peace.